Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Fletcher School's event on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We are pleased to have you join us today for an important conversation and what I think will be an interesting panel discussion about the current humanitarian crisis that has been caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including the international humanitarian and human rights law implications, the allegations of war crimes committed by the Russian military, humanitarian assistance, as well as refugees and internally displaced people. Today we have four distinguished panelists. Unfortunately, Professor Diane Mazarana was not able to join us, but we have Professor Karen Jacobson. She is the Henry J. Lear Professor in Global Migration at the Fletcher School, and she directs the Refugees in Towns project at the Feinstein International Center. Her current research explores urban displacement and global migration. She focuses on refugee and migration issues, as well as humanitarian assistance, urban impact, and climate change. We are also pleased to be joined by Professor Gregory Gottlieb. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Friedman School of Nutrition. He served as the director of the Feinstein International Center from 2017 to just last year when he retired. During his tenure as director, his research and teaching focused on the politics of humanitarian and development assistance, the current and future personal implications for humanitarian response and development programs, and leadership needs in humanitarian response. We are also delighted to be joined by Polina Bilyukova. She is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School. She also manages the Center for Strategic Studies here at Fletcher, and her research focuses on civil-military relations, intrastate conflict, and international security, with a regional interest in Russia, Ukraine, as well as Israel. And last but not least, we have Professor John Cerrone. He is a visiting professor of international law at the Fletcher School, but he also holds faculty appointments at the American University, Washington College of Law, as well as the University of London. And his areas of expertise are human rights and international business, human rights and humanitarian law, international criminal law, refugee law and migration law, international courts and tribunals, hate speech and the freedom of expression, and the law in conflict and post-conflict settings. My name is Arik Burakovsky. I am the Assistant Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program, and I will be moderating the conversation today. I should start by saying that the war in Ukraine is a tremendous tragedy, and it's been a challenge for me both professionally and personally, because I have family ties both in Russia and Ukraine. So this topic is near and dear to me. The war has thus far displaced 7 million people internally and 5 million refugees. And it has led to tens of thousands of casualties, including tens of thousands of civilians who have died. And so I think we'll have a lot to talk about in the next 90 minutes or so. And for the audience members, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your Zoom hand or type the question in the chat. After each of the panelists has made opening remarks, we will open it up for questions and answers. So without further ado, Professor Jacobson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arik. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's great to be here and to see everybody, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm going to make just a few comments about, and really to put the Ukraine displacement and migration experience into a bit of a global context, which I feel I do every time there's a humanitarian or other kind of emergency. What I'm about to say, in no way do I want to diminish the terrible experience of what's happening in Ukraine and the horrific displacement and killing that's going on. But I do want to say that, or give you a short anecdote, which is that a couple of weeks ago, I was in Uganda and down on the border with the Congo. And at that time, when I was there a couple of weeks ago, there was a major emergency in the Congo, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And at least 30,000 refugees have come across from the Congo into Uganda in the last few weeks. There has been no mention of this in any media that I've seen, not even in the Ugandan media. And the tragedy of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo has been going on for 25 years. There have been way more people displaced and killed and maimed and raped than have happened in Ukraine. But we never see any evidence of this. And nobody is even slightly aware of it. Nobody has even the faintest idea where this conflict is happening for the most part. So just to say that these emergencies, we saw Afghanistan a few months ago. Now we see Ukraine. Again, these are ongoing emergencies. I'm not diminishing them, but to say that all of the attention of the world is now on Ukraine, and that has consequences for other emergencies. Funding has been cut to long-standing protracted emergencies, and people just don't get any assistance. And so, because all of the funding and all the media attention, all the political capital and attention is going toward the Ukraine. So sorry to put this, I just feel that it's necessary for us to draw our attention away for a second, to blink in the direction of other emergencies and displacements that are going on before we return to focus on Ukraine. The second thing I want to say about Ukraine is we don't know what will happen, obviously, to people who have been displaced, who have become refugees from the Ukraine. We don't know when the war will end and what will happen to people who've been displaced. But if we look at the history of displacement in the world, what we know is that it is most likely that people who have become refugees and are currently living in neighboring countries, those people will want to return home. If we put all of our attention on trying to resettle people and trying to move them to the US or wherever else, and focusing efforts and energy and resources on resettlement, in my mind, this is a major error. And it will not work out, because in the end, most people, we should put resources into helping them return. And in my view, when Ukraine stabilizes, under whatever circumstances that may be, people will want to go back. So I think the efforts to get the US to resettle more and more refugees are somewhat misguided. I'm sure that'll be a very unpopular position to have, and I'm sure it'll come back to bite me, but I do want to say that. And I'll close my comments with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jacobson. Professor Gottlieb.
Thanks, Arik, and thanks for having me. I agree with what one of the things I was going to comment on was just exactly what Karen commented on, and that is that while this is the magnitude of this emergency within a very short period of time is considerable. Just to add on to what Karen said, if we look at the Horn of Africa now, we're seeing another drought affecting the Horn, and the numbers there would exceed this. We're up to around the 20 million mark now. So not to say that what's happening in Ukraine isn't suffering for those people, but it does give you a sense of what the strains and stresses are on the humanitarian world, where in any given year, you might have about 50 to 60% of funding met. So when you add on, every time you add on another major disaster, it puts more pressure on the humanitarian system. Ukraine, in one of the recent, appeals, they made it up to about 70% so far, which is pretty good for most appeals. So trying to keep that in perspective. as Karen said, we have 5 million refugees that are out there, and they're all in the surrounding countries. What I think is mostly in the surrounding countries, and what I think is most interesting, this is an urban war for the most part. People have left their homes, crossed the borders into an urban setting. The vast majority of people are staying with friends or relatives, which is not like other kind of major urban disasters. And that, I think that in itself takes a little bit of pressure off the international community, because the hosting community is doing a lot. So the real question for the international community is how does it partner with the local organizations who are going to see to these daily needs. In other words, if you look at what the Polish government has done, it's providing small stipends. It's trying to register people, provide small stipends to Ukrainians. It's trying to provide stipends to people that are hosting Ukrainians. So I think that, and if we look at it, it's not a camp setting. This is a very different kind of emergency where the tools that you use to bring relief are probably around cash and vouchers and supporting current medical systems rather than trying to build up a system. So I think that's important. Again, on the funding issue, I think there has been quite a bit of money that's come in from the Americans and the EU and others, even from like about 200 million from the private sector as well that I've seen reported. So you always want to keep in mind what is the absorptive capacity of a huge influx of money. Even when you see all that need, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can absorb all that money immediately, because systems have to be built, they have to expand, you have to get additional people. Interestingly, when you look at, like an MSF group, Doctors Without Borders that may be out there working, a lot of the people they may have with them are locals. So the question is, were those people displaced, they're nurses or doctors displaced from one place and now they're with MSF, or are they drawing from a pool that may be short-staffed as it is? So there's always those issues to worry about in terms of personnel. I wanted to say a word about what this war looks like, and others are going to comment on this, and I think I'll leave it to Sabina to comment on local partners. But having worked for a number of years on Syria, on the crisis in Aleppo, much of what we see in a place like Mariupol looks very similar to Aleppo. Absolute, not just the destruction of the city, but it's how the humanitarian efforts are treated, where convoys and personnel are taken, where convoys are attacked, where civilians are targeted, places where they congregate are targeted. So for me, this is not surprising to see this happen. It does, of course, the sad part is that we see how deadly these armaments are, but just what the strategy is around these cities. So the question you have to ask yourself, I think, if you're in the humanitarian world right now is, okay, if the Russians eventually pull out, what does reconstruction look like? In other words, you need to start thinking about that now, not later, because this is a huge, there's huge destruction in Ukraine, and I think this is a really important thing to think about. Finally, I just want to say that, as I said kind of earlier, this is a huge humanitarian emergency, but it is comparable to others, like in Yemen, where the numbers are 12, 13, 14 million, in a population that's a little over 20 million. So you can see the size of the scope of what's happening elsewhere. And I think, to just echo what Karen said, despite the needs that exist now with the Ukrainians, it's really important to not take our eyes off the other emergencies that are out there, because those needs are just as great, and you have to try to do both. We're not very successful at that most of the time, but you have to try. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Professor Gottlieb. Polina?
Yeah, thank you, Arik. So when you introduced me, you said that I'm a scholar of civil-military relations, and most of my comments were supposed to pertain to that issue and how it reflects on humanitarian relief. But before I address that issue, I just want to make a brief disclaimer that I am Ukrainian. I was born in Kyiv, lived there for 25 years of my life. Bucha and Irpin are not just weird words that I learned to read in English letters 2 weeks ago, but it's actually the satellite cities in which many of my friends and families lived before the war and hope to continue living when this war is over. Why am I making this disclaimer? Because it definitely makes me biased, but also some would say that it makes me well positioned to talk about certain issues. So I just warn our audience that everything I say, of course, subject to that bias, but also to that position of familiarity with context. Before I address the military issues, I would like to say that it's very important to abstain from engaging in suffering Olympics, because what is going on now is that the world is a terrible place to live, and ongoing emergencies are happening at the moment in many locations on this planet. And the question that we should be asking is not whether Ukrainians are getting too much attention, but are we paying enough attention to other emergencies? It's first, and also what can we learn from the existing response to Ukrainian emergency that can be then used in other places, and what are the mechanisms that work, local mechanisms and international mechanisms, and force their use in other emergencies, rather than talking about the fact that, oh, Ukrainians are European, that's true, Ukrainians are white, that's true, Ukrainians are getting more media coverage because of that, that's also true. But the solution to this is not to decrease the media coverage of Ukrainians, but actually to pay more attention to places like DRC, Yemen, and other humanitarian crises in the world. Now, what pertains to the military situation on the ground. One of the questions, Arik, that you sent us before this meeting was whether Bucha is an aberration, the tragic events that happened in one of the Kyiv satellite cities. Bucha is not a suburb of Kyiv, it's a satellite city, and that's important because the density of population is much higher, and it means that any number of civilian casualties that are reported so far, we could safely assume that they're much higher because of the high population density, because of the multi-story buildings. So just to keep that in mind. So whether the massacre that happened in Bucha is an aberration from Russian usual tactics, or it's actually an employed tactics, I would argue that it could be considered as a strategy, a policy, and also a byproduct of persistent and systemic violence within the Russian military as institution. So as a policy, from the most recent speeches of President Vladimir Putin, we can understand that the existence of Ukraine as a state and Ukrainians as a nation is considered by him as a threat to Russian security and statehood. And in this case, massacre that we witnessed in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and many other places that are still under Russian control, so we are yet to discover what's going on there. It's part of policy, and I would not be afraid to use this word, a genocidal policy. It's of course a challenge to establish a genocidal intent. However, some of the speeches of Putin refer to the policy there. Also, it is a strategy of coercion by targeting civilian population. And this strategy is not new. It was used in both Chechen wars, and we know about it. And not only in Chechen wars, but that's the example, like geographically most close to Ukraine. Also, it is a byproduct of persistent structural and systemic violence within Russian military as an institution. The tradition of hazing is all penetrating. The numbers of suicide because of hazing within the Russian military institution are very high and they are underreported all the time. So this violence that is brewing within the institution, we should not be surprised that when the rubber hits the road, we see more and more rape, violence, and cruelty coming from the people who are the products of this very violent system of Russian military. And just as an example before I finish here, is that when the Kremlin was struggling to suppress Russian opposition, they sent several opposition leaders to the military as a punishment for their opposition activities. It's just to illustrate that Russian military, even within the state, is considered as a punitive mechanism for young men. So you can imagine that when Russian soldiers are deployed in the actual battlefield, they will, of course, display this aggression and violence that they receive as a part of their socialization within this institution. I will end here.
Thank you, Polina. And now Professor Cerrone.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm pleased to join you all this evening. I'm going to be speaking about humanitarian law, international criminal law, and human rights law, and how they apply in this context. I probably can't cover all of that in 7 minutes, but we'll see how far I get. And then if you have any lingering questions, we can discuss them in the Q&A. I'll start off with international humanitarian law, which is also known as the international law of armed conflict. These are the rules of international law that regulate an armed conflict once it has begun. So these rules regulate the conduct of the hostilities, and they provide certain legal protections for individuals who are not taking part in the hostilities, like civilians, and also for individuals who are no longer taking part in the hostilities. So for example, combatants who are sick and wounded or have been otherwise placed out of combat. So what is the applicable IHL or humanitarian law in this conflict? We're talking about the Fourth Hague Convention of 1907, the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, and also additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1977. Additional Protocol 1 it's not entirely customary, so it is relevant to see if Russia and Ukraine are parties, and in fact, both Russia and Ukraine are parties to that treaty, Protocol 1. So all of this applies as treaty law. There are so many allegations in the news about war crimes and violations of IHL. I'm just going to focus on one area of IHL, and that is the rules on the conduct of hostilities, and in particular, targeting issues. Targeting issues are usually quite tricky, even in clearer circumstances. Here, we know that the president of Ukraine has called upon civilians to resist and has distributed weapons to civilians. Sorry, I just had to mention to my Amazon device that she should stop talking. So we have a situation where there is some blurring between civilians and combatants, and introducing some ambiguities into targeting issues. The basic principle that governs this is the principle of distinction. All parties to the armed conflict are obliged to distinguish at all times between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. In other words, generally, you're allowed to target combatants, you're not allowed to target civilians, you're allowed to target military objectives, you're not allowed to target civilian objects. Now, there are some exceptions to these rules. So generally, combatants are targetable at all times and all places on the basis of their status. However, they cease to be targetable if they're surrendering, if they're sick and wounded, if they're so sick and wounded that they're incapacitated, basically, or if they're otherwise hors de combat. So for example, if they've been captured and detained, at that point in time, you can no longer kill them, at least not without a trial. You can't just summarily execute them. For civilians, generally, again, they cannot be targeted, but there is an exception if civilians directly participate in the hostilities. In the current situation in Ukraine, we've seen a couple of phenomena. One, that some civilians have become part of the armed forces. So some have volunteered to become members of the armed forces. At that point in time, they transform from civilian into combatant. They are thenceforth targetable on the basis of that combatant status. Some civilians have spontaneously taken up arms to resist the enemy. That's called a levée en masse. Those civilians as well have transformed into combatants and are thus targetable. The upside of being a combatant, of course, is you get POW status upon capture. The downside, you become targetable. And this targetability based on status means it's really irrelevant what the person is doing at the time. So you may have seen the story about the Russian bombing of a barracks full of sleeping soldiers. Unfortunately, that's lawful. It doesn't matter if the soldiers are actually fighting at the time. They can be sleeping in their beds. If they are still combatants, they're targetable based on their status. Again, unless they're surrendering, sick and wounded, etc. On the other hand, civilians are not targetable unless and for such time as they take a direct part in the hostilities. So again, generally you can't target civilians, but their conduct in a given instance might make them targetable. So here I might refer to the news stories about Ukrainian women in particular gathering to make Molotov cocktails. And so the question arises, is making a Molotov cocktail direct participation in the hostilities? It likely depends on their proximity to where that Molotov cocktail is going to be used. So it's possible that some of these civilians who have not taken up arms but are assisting in the war effort may become targetable based on direct participation in the hostilities. There's some debate about what the criteria are for direct participation and some disagreement about what the necessary threshold is. But if for example, the Ukrainian grandmother is in her kitchen making a Molotov cocktail for her grandson who comes in and takes the Molotov cocktail, runs out and throws it, that would likely be direct participation in the hostilities, making the grandmother targetable as well. If a bunch of people are preparing Molotov cocktails far away from the front lines, that would be more analogous to a weapons factory. Now, the weapons that are being created are targetable. They would be a military objective, but the people making the weapons would not necessarily be directly participating in the hostilities. So can you bomb the military objective, the weapons, if there are civilians nearby who are not directly participating in the hostilities? That would be an issue of proportionality. So even if an attack is directed at a military objective and some civilians die, that doesn't mean the attack is unlawful just because civilians die as a result, so-called collateral damage or incidental damage. The attack will become unlawful if that incidental or collateral damage is disproportionate to the value of the military objective that you're neutralizing. So what should we glean from all of this? It's really complicated. And in the heat of battle, it's extremely difficult to determine whether or not these rules have been violated. Just because a hospital has been shelled is not conclusive evidence that IHL has been violated. We would need to know, was the hospital intentionally shelled or was it accidental? Were they shelling actually a military objective near the hospital and the hospital was collateral damage? Also, was the hospital being used for a military purpose? Was it being used to inflict acts harmful to the enemy? If so, the hospital becomes targetable. There would still be a duty to warn in that instance. But in any event, again, very difficult to determine in the heat of battle whether or not these conduct of hostilities rules have been violated. There are some indications that point in the direction of IHL violations. So for example, when we've seen people who appear to have been executed while their hands were tied, even if the person was a soldier, if their hands have been tied, we would say they are now hors de combat. They've been captured. They're in the power of the enemy. At that point in time, you cannot summarily execute the person. You can kill them on the battlefield, but once they are out of combat, once they've been detained, killing them without a trial would be a summary execution, and it would be a violation of IHL and also a war crime. Please do let me know if I'm running too long. I just want to mention now the issue of mercenaries. You've seen a number of reports recently about foreigners going to fight in Ukraine. In general, the law of armed conflict does not prohibit the use of mercenaries. There is a separate treaty banning the use of mercenaries at the global level. Very few states are parties. However, Ukraine is a party to that treaty. Russia is not. So here we might have an issue of opposability. One party to the conflict is a party to this treaty that prohibits the use of mercenaries. The other party to the conflict is not a party to that treaty. So how does it apply in that situation? Now, of course, it bans the use of mercenaries, but there is a very elaborate definition of what constitutes a mercenary. Would some of these foreign fighters, whether used by Ukraine or Russia, be considered mercenaries? Well, a key criterion for determining whether someone is a mercenary is, are they motivated by money? Are they motivated by compensation? If that's their motivation, that's a requirement for being a mercenary. If that's not their motivation, then they're not a mercenary. There's another provision of the definition that talks about how much the individual may be compensated. They'd have to be compensated more than the average member of the state's regular armed forces. So if Ukraine were paying them extra beyond what they would pay to their regular armed forces, that would be another element of meeting this definition of mercenary. It appears that that's not the case, so it's unlikely that these individuals would qualify as mercenaries. A related issue is the foreign fighter phenomenon. A number of states enacted legislation in the wake of the Security Council decision from a few years ago concerning ISIS. You may recall the Security Council required all member states of the UN to criminalize their nationals going to be foreign fighters in a terrorist context. A number of states enacted broadly sweeping domestic legislation prohibiting this phenomenon, and it's possible that some individuals going to fight in Ukraine might fall afoul of this legislation. For example, the UK government alluded to this possibility when it told its citizens not to go fight, to not participate in the armed conflict in Ukraine. There are also issues of weapons regulation that arise under IHL in this context. So, for example, am I running out of time, Arik? All right, so
yeah,
I will
just wrap up.
Okay, I'll wrap it up with just a few words about war crimes. Not every violation of humanitarian law is a war crime. Only very serious violations of the law of armed conflict constitute war crimes. Similarly, war crimes are just one category of international crime. There's also crimes against humanity and genocide. All three of these crimes are within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and the ICC has jurisdiction over the situation in Ukraine because Ukraine is a party to that treaty. I think I'll leave it there. If people have questions about the ICC or about the application of human rights law, feel free to ask me during the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Cerrone. And we're also pleased to be joined by Sabina Robillard. She is the coordinator of the Master of Arts in Humanitarian Affairs program and is a doctoral student at the Friedman School of Nutrition. She's worked on disaster response, public health emergencies, peace building, and conservation. And we'll give her some time just to make brief comments about local humanitarian action. Sabina?
Hi, my name is Sabina Robillard, and I'm actually going to make maybe the mirror kind of disclaimer that Paulina made before, which is that I personally have no connections to Ukraine. I've never been there, never lived there, never worked there. And that's not even my regional area of expertise for studying. And so all of my comments today are more about generalized from what we know about local humanitarian action in general. And the thing about local humanitarian action is that it needs to be grounded in local context and understanding of these local scenarios. So I think there might even be people on this call and on this panel and participants here who know more than I do about this, and specifically with the context of Ukraine. So I want to defer to them in this space. But I just wanted to bring up a couple of very brief points, because when we think about humanitarian action in general, there tends to be this image of a very formalized, internationalized response. We think about large trucks, land cruisers, UN convoys. We think about large international NGOs with significant name recognition like World Vision or Save the Children. But the reality is that the first humanitarian action to happen in any crisis is always local. It's always coming from the people who are geographically and socially the most connected and closest to the people who've been directly affected by the fighting and or the crisis, the displacement, whatever the emergency might be. And oftentimes these groups will come in shapes and forms that might not be recognizable to the kind of standard international system. Again, your UN agencies, your large NGOs. These can be spontaneous volunteers, individuals, informal associations, church groups, mosques, neighborhood self-help networks, even non-state armed actors or formal armed actors can all play a role in humanitarian response. And so it's really important to recognize the international humanitarian system has over the years increasingly recognized how important it is to engage with and follow the leadership of local humanitarian actors in these different scenarios, because when people who are affected by crises and local organizations we do have evidence that those responses are more effective, more efficient, more appropriate, and tend to be more sustainable. Again, I don't have a lot of details specifically about the responses in Ukraine and the neighboring countries, but I have heard recently from some local activists in neighboring countries who have been part of those responses, and I do think that this one story kind of is emblematic of what to look out for with local humanitarian response in the context of Ukraine. I was, happened to listen to a speech from a woman who runs a feminist network in Poland, who has set up spontaneously, these incredible crisis response centers, across the country. And she mentioned how everyone had spent, this feminist organization had, on the kind of turn of a dime overnight, changed what they were doing from reproductive rights work and advocacy to helping, refugees and displaced persons who'd come into the area. But that had taken, a lot of their time, a lot of their resources, and they'd been looking to connect up with the international system and had systematically felt shut out. They systematically felt left behind, and that there was a big gap between the official response and them. And that can be really damaging for a number of reasons. Crises tend to have big impacts on civil societies, some transformative and positive, some many negative. And she mentioned, again, almost feeling invisibilized by the response. And this is something that the international humanitarian system has wrestled with for a long time. So I'm just going to conclude my thoughts there and mention, we hope that over the years, the system has learned how important it is to listen to my toddler, to displaced persons themselves, to people in host communities that are mobilizing responses, and to really respect the diversity of opinions and voices in crisis affected populations, that they can better lead and influence responses.
Sabina, thank you so much. So I have a question to each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to question and answer from the audience. So please do not hesitate to either type your questions in the chat or to raise your Zoom hand. So Karen, going back to you, we've talked about local humanitarian action. We've also talked about how the international humanitarian aid system has mobilized in response to Ukraine, perhaps more so than to some other conflicts, humanitarian crises going on around the world. You mentioned that it's important to put resources to help refugees eventually return to their homes. And I'm wondering if there's a distinction between the resources that ought to be provided to refugees as opposed to internally displaced people. Greg mentioned that those 5 million refugees are in need of cash because the local infrastructure in countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and others in Central and Eastern Europe are able to welcome them. But when it comes to the internally displaced people, oftentimes it seems they're in need of medicine and food, clothing, and other resources. So perhaps you can speak to that. And also, who are some of the major external actors when it comes to the humanitarian relief efforts, including international bodies, non-governmental organizations, countries?
Okay, that's a lot, Arik. I'll go to the last. As has already been said by Sabina, one of the most, a group of the most important actors are people who are already on the ground working, whether they're small civil society organizations or community-based organizations or churches and mosques, or whether they're just local or even national NGOs. the most important providers of humanitarian assistance. But when we take it to scale, the most important providers obviously are the donors, like countries like the US and the EU, and who provide funds to NGOs like the International Rescue Committee, and of course, and most importantly, those donors, those states provide funds to the UN agencies. And in the case of refugees, the UN agency responsible is the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, but also very much involved would be the World Food Program, UNICEF, and other UN agencies that are involved in these. You know, I'm often asked by people, as I'm sure my colleagues on this panel are, as in, what should I do? Who should I give money to? And we're hearing some of the wackiest things out there, like people sending, you know, GoFundMe, buying Ukrainian fighter jets, God knows. But I would say that, you know, what people could do if they want to support is to send to established organizations, not to new jump up organizations who often have no experience working in humanitarian assistance and let's face it, could well be crooks. So I think when it comes to this issue of refugees versus IDPs, internally displaced people, it's always a problem because refugees get more attention than internally displaced people do. And because they get more media attention and more political attention, that means they are more resourced than internally displaced people. But of course, the entity that's responsible for internally displaced people is the government. And it is the government, in addition to, as Sabina said, local organizations and other NGOs. But it's the government who's eventually and ultimately responsible for internally displaced people. And at least as far as I've seen in this case, we clearly have a Ukrainian government who is very much seized with taking care of internally displaced people. So support to the Ukrainian government from the donors and from UN and other agencies and even charitable organ is good. I think we should be giving money and funds to them. And of course, that is where all the funds are going. So yeah, but I think it's always good to bear in mind this distinction between internally displaced people and refugees, because there is this tension between who gets what and from whom, and who is responsible for those different populations of people. So yeah. I know you had more in your question, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. And I think it's also important to note that as the Russian military has been regrouping and moving away from cities like Kiev and Chernihiv, actually many of the internally displaced people are now returning to their homes. So perhaps we can talk about what that looks like. Also, for refugees who may be returning to Ukraine even before the war is over. But I want to turn it over to Greg. You mentioned the difficulty of providing humanitarian assistance to besieged cities like Mariupol. How do we make sure that humanitarian corridors that have been negotiated between the Russian and Ukrainian governments actually function in the way they're supposed to? I mean, you've seen this in other conflicts like Syria. Are there any lessons that we can learn?
I can go back more than 30 years to several cross-border types of emergencies that I worked on in Sudan and Ethiopia, and keeping open humanitarian corridors. It is a standard practice now to try to create those corridors. It is an endless matter of negotiation to keep them open, because as wars shift, as things change on the battlefield, it impacts your ability to keep open those corridors. And also, it's not just a question of whether you think you have the guarantees that you need to move, because I think what we've heard in this war, it's just typical of what we usually hear, is you may have an agreement high up, but that will not translate down to the field level, to a particular checkpoint. And so, you know, the challenge for all the humanitarians, whether you're ICRC or your WFP is getting those guarantees and understanding that everybody along the line, all the combatants along the line, understand what's been agreed to. Because unless you do that, you cannot. It's too dangerous to move your trucks and your personnel down the road. I think the challenge here is that we've already seen in a number of places where you know, people were supposed to civilians were supposed to come out, and you see the limitations of that. So I'm not surprised at that. It really is, Arik, the ability to negotiate. And in this instance, the question is who is it that is there that has any kind of that has the right access? And in many cases, we would see these kinds of evacuations of civilians to be ICRC's province. And of course, you know, there's been some debate over whether Mao or the president should have gone to Moscow and shaken hands with Lavrov and others. But the fact is that ICRC still occupies that kind of ground and is the organization for trying to do that. If it's moving food, it's in medical care, it's usually going to be on top of WFP and others. And I think, again, it's trying to have those conversations that brings those reassurances. Unfortunately, what we have here is a member of the Security Council who pretty willy-nilly is willing to defy international norms. We saw that in Aleppo over and over and over, and I can just keep saying over and over again because of the cruelty with which they undermined the humanitarian corridors. But again, despite the difficulties, it's just, you got to keep at it. You just have to keep at it because that's the only way you're going to get anything in and get people out. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Greg. Polina, as someone who understands the local context a bit better, I wanted to give you a chance to react to what other panelists have said. And I'm really most interested in what John said earlier about the role of civilians with weapons, volunteer fighters, foreign fighters, and mercenaries on either the Russian or the Ukrainian side of the hostilities. How do they fit into Russian or Ukrainian military tactics, and what are some of the dilemmas associated with their roles in this war?
Sure, thank you, Arik. So I would first like to reinforce several points that have already been mentioned here. So Professor Jacobson mentioned the importance of supporting trustworthy organizations and those who know what they're doing. And in this context, it's important to remember about the hierarchies of expertise. And too often these hierarchies, they actually don't start from what we consider as the top. So for example, in Ukraine, there are several organizations that actually know what they're doing. They are working together with the Ministry of Defense. They're working together with the local networks in distributing humanitarian support. However, unfortunately, their websites look like, I will use this word, trash. They look schemy, they look weird. And I have to remind you that PayPal actually was introduced in Ukraine after the beginning of war. So often, if you want to support some very local but capable actors, you have to step over this barrier of donating to something that only has a Facebook page. So several days ago, I just made an effort and I added a Support Ukraine page to my personal website with a list of 5 different initiatives of different scope and size that I personally know that they know what they're doing on the ground, that they do exactly what they report to be doing, that are transparent about where your funds actually go. The problem with them that they do not strictly conform to only military, only humanitarian, only medical, or only animal rescue, for example. So for your convenience, I even added some emojis to guide you if you don't want to support like military actions. So support this organization. If you want to support Ukrainian military and want to donate to some people on the ground who know what they're doing, donate to those people. I'm sending this in the group chat because it is important that people in Ukraine, whether it's the military or civilians, receive what they need and not what, for example, the United States thinks they need. Because again, this point about resettling Ukrainians in the United States, some of them might benefit from it, those who have relatives here. But for most of it, it's not what they need. It's true that people would rather prefer to actually come back to their homes than being resettled in the United States across the Atlantic Ocean. Come on. So it's just the point.
My understanding is that many of the refugees are currently women, children, and sometimes the elderly, because men ages 18 to 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine at the moment.
Yes, but they were allowed to leave in the first days of the conflict, and some of them did leave. So also when we use the word refugee, we have to be very careful because we use it colloquially here, but many Ukrainians in Europe, they actually apply for a temporary protected status, meaning that their status in the EU will actually end when the international community will decide that the war is terminated, that there is no danger to their life in Ukraine. And that's another point in support to what Professor Jacobson said, that maybe resettlement in the United States is not what people actually need, because if they choose to pursue this status of temporary protection rather than refugee status, it means that their intent is not to strive to begin their second, or for some of them third, new life, because many of them were IDPs after the first episode of this war. And unfortunately, we have the story in my family personally. Now they have to become refugees in Europe. They don't want that. They want to come back. So again, because of this, we have to be very careful about who decides what Ukrainians even need and to make sure that it's actually Ukrainians. So when it comes to this blurring between civilians and the military and what's going on really on the ground. So in January of this year, Ukrainian government enacted a law that actually outlines different levels of what they call national resistance to the invasion. And it identifies that there is the regular Ukrainian military, Ukrainian armed forces. There are territorial defense battalions that engage volunteers, but those are not civilians with arms. Those are uniformed people with very basic training, that's true, carrying arms that they actually received from the government, and acting under command of the armed forces of Ukraine. Those are not volunteer militias or any kind of uncontrolled volunteer groups that just shoot people left and right. So they are part of the Ukrainian armed forces because they are under command of Ukrainian armed forces, and they also wear the uniform of Ukrainian armed forces. However, the same law also presumes that every civilian in Ukraine, hypothetically, can decide to join the resistance in less conventional forms. For example, yes, to request to receive the weapons, to receive weapons training without joining the territorial defense battalion, for example, and many other forms of resistance. So on paper, that's true. Even Ukrainian law blurs this distinction between civilians and the military. The issue, though, that's actually on the ground, that part of the law that describes this shadowy level of civilian resistance to the invasion has never been enacted. It has never been put in action. So those civilians with hidden weapons in their wardrobes, they don't exist yet. However, it was planned. It's just because the war was enacted only in January and the war started in February. So this part of the plan has not happened yet. About foreign fighters. The main issue with foreign fighters in Ukraine is that they are great for PR. We hear a lot about them, but the Ukrainian military was not ready to integrate them into their command structure. So many of these foreigners, they arrive, and the Ukrainian military says, I'm sorry, we don't have weapons for you. We don't have armored vests. We don't have helmets. We will prioritize people who actually are trained and speak relevant languages. Then you volunteers, thank you, by the way, for arriving, but we have different priorities. So in theory, they could have caused more trouble in terms of these like issues with and friction with integration them into the actual armed forces. But the main issue for now is actually that some of them are not even part of the Ukrainian military for now. So there are some very disappointed foreign fighters. To wrap it up, what's going on in Ukraine creates potential for more problems than we currently see on the ground. For example, that civilian resistance of quasi-combatants, it's not there yet. It could be. The same about foreign fighters. There are many issues with foreign fighters in terms of civilian control, in terms of crimes, in terms of keeping them accountable to Ukrainian laws or the laws of armed conflict. However, they are not currently deployed in sufficient numbers to even cause these problems. There is an international territorial defense battalion, or I don't remember what is the official label. It is mostly used for PR communications, I would say, which is also important for advancing the Ukrainian cause, of course, but in terms of the actual combat on the ground, they're not there yet.
Thank you, Polina. And John, last question from me goes to you. You mentioned that it's very difficult to investigate allegations of war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. If investigations were to take place, how would they be conducted? What would be the roles of Russia, Ukraine, and the international community? And ultimately, who could be held accountable or prosecuted for the alleged atrocities?
Okay, so the International Criminal Court has actually already begun its investigation. So it's unusual that they were actually able to gain access to the territory so soon. So the investigations have started, but they take time. And especially for war crimes charges, if you're looking at conduct of hostilities rules, they need a tremendous amount of information and intelligence, including, well, what was the military strategy of the party that's alleged to have committed the IHL violation? So part of what I'm trying to emphasize is that it's very difficult to determine these things quickly. It's going to take time to determine whether or not war crimes have been committed. At the same time, war crimes are common. War crimes happen in every armed conflict in history. So for sure, war crimes will have occurred. Whether or not they will get prosecuted is a separate matter. Certainly, if there's evidence that war crimes were happening as a matter of policy and it wasn't just a few bad apples, so to speak, there'll be a greater priority for the prosecution of war crimes. Crimes against humanity, different category of international crimes. To establish a crime against humanity, you have to establish that there was an attack directed against a civilian population. There's a scale requirement. There's also a policy requirement that there had to be a policy to direct this attack against a civilian population. The other crime we mentioned before, genocide. Genocide, the most difficult thing to prove, as Polina had mentioned, is the intent requirement. That has a very special intent requirement. In order to be genocide, the perpetrator needs to be acting with the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. It needs to be one of the protected groups under the convention. And the negotiating history of the convention makes clear that destruction means biological, physical destruction of the group. So an intent to expel a group, forcibly displace, or to ethnically cleanse an area with measures short of biologically destroying the group, that would not constitute genocide. So it's the idea of cultural genocide, wiping out a group's identity, and even Biden had mentioned, the issue of identity, that alone is generally not considered enough to establish genocide. There are some scholars who advocate for a broader interpretation, but that broader interpretation has not yet been adopted by any international court. They've pretty much maintained the focus on physical, biological destruction. And part of the reason for that is, there's a fear about genocide losing its stigma if it is applied too broadly. And so they try to keep the definition very narrow so that when it does happen, it is greatly stigmatized and there is a real compulsion to respond.
Thank you, John. There's a question in the chat from Stanislav Stanskik. He asks about what kind of response could come from Russia's civil society and democratic diaspora to the war and to the humanitarian crisis that it has caused, considering the deterioration of political expressions within Russia. Polina, perhaps this is something you could take?
I have a brief answer that, of course, it will not cover all the bases, but many Russians are currently fleeing their country, and many of them resettle them, say, in Georgia and Tbilisi and other locations. Russians, they are uniquely positioned in this situation, especially those who have already left their country. They speak at least one language that Ukrainians can understand, and many of them actually speak some other language of the state, for example, English or German or French, especially if they left Russia before the beginning of this war. And of course, it's very difficult to say about every particular case, but many Russians, they actually meet this criteria of knowing at least two languages that can be very useful for Ukrainian refugees in Europe, for example. So one of the ways Russians can help is actually visit the border areas in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, and to help resettle people to find new homes, to deal with the bureaucracy, to support them, especially, and it's not only because of the language, but also because people who flee the conflict areas, they're traumatized, and having someone more level-headed, I understand that Russians are also suffering because of their own regime, but if they are more level-headed than people who actually fled the war zone, it can be a great help for them, someone to help them navigate through the bureaucracy and to talk to them in languages that they can understand and that bureaucracy can understand too.
Thank you, Polina. There are a series of messages in the chat from Alexandra Polyakova. I wasn't sure if she wanted to ask a question. Alexandra, are you there? Perhaps you can turn on your microphone if you have a question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the panel. I actually put comments because it's important for me to contribute, and I don't want to take time of other participants for their questions. I don't have a particular one in mind. Obviously, I can reflect on many points already said in this panel, and I don't have a question right now, but thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, perhaps I have another one, and this was a question that wasn't addressed by any of the panelists, but was among those we included in the event announcement, and that has to do with the role of social media in this conflict, and I would also add open source investigation. So there has been a lot of talk on social media about the various alleged atrocities, including some we mentioned, indiscriminate violence, summary execution, deportations, looting, targeting of hospitals and schools, mistreatment of prisoners of war, gender-based violence, and so on. What positive as well as negative roles can social media play in conflicts like this? Perhaps there are lessons from previous conflicts around the world that we can gather. Karen or Greg, do you have any insights into this?
Well, certainly, I think we've all been in many respects plagued by social media. But I do think when it comes to trying to make a determination of things that happened, I think some of the photography that's come out from well-known photographers is fairly damning in what you can see in those photos. But I think for everybody that goes online, I mean, I think we all struggle with what are those sources. I mean, Paulina herself said, you know, here's an organization that's trying to raise money, but some of those could be scam organizations. Some of those could be groups that are affiliated with the Russians. I think it's become, particularly in Europe, where, you know, you still have an abundance of reporters. I mean, one of the real challenges, in, as Karen noted, in East Africa, and particularly in Eastern Congo, is, you know, many of the major papers and networks have withdrawn many of their reporters from those areas. So you don't get the same kind of coverage as we see now in Europe. But I still think it's very important to, I don't want to say reserve judgment, but I think we could see how, we get a sense of how bad things are. But it's like Professor Cerrone said, you know, you need to be careful in considering the circumstances under which something happened, who made it happen, was the reporting accurate? Because, you know, when you scream, you know, when you're talking about those things and it turns out not to be true, it undermines the rest of what you want to try to do on the humanitarian side. Because humanitarians are, you know, there has been a critique that that humanitarians oftentimes will talk up a crisis that's in its worst than it is, or so it's important, I think, to consider for groups that are reporting how they report, and secondly, for those that are trying to look for information, to look across a variety of sources, because it's just really very easy to stay locked into one piece of news, and it undermines, I think, what are many good efforts out there to bring humanitarian assistance. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would say, let me jump in also. I agree with what Greg said very much. I would add that the social media has been a huge problem and also a huge boon to people, because of course social media helps people find safety. You know, it's if you're trying to get from one place to another, you go onto your social media connections and you use that to help you navigate now. So it's a huge boon to people who are displaced or fleeing, and it can help them. But on the other hand, as Greg said, there's the issue of social media creating these stories, creating single lines of narrative. And indeed, not just social media, but in general, the media, as I've heard from my European colleagues, the media is extremely, the narrative and discourse about this war is extremely narrow. We're not getting a wide range of views about what's going on, because literally in Europe, as I've heard, I've not verified this, some radio stations have literally been closed down. So I worry how narrow the view is, how concentrated and homogenous the news is. Everyone is churning it the same way. And of course, social media just amps that up even more. People who use their Facebook feeds are only getting one line, one story. So to me, that's the big problem about understanding what's going on now. Not enough coverage from independent journalists, from trained and skilled journalists, but plenty of coverage of who knows what. On the other hand, you know, if you're trying to find your way out of a terrible situation, then of course social media are super helpful. So yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Paulina, did you want to say something, or am I mistaken? Okay. Well, there's another question from Babil Nabutovsky, and he asks about the capacity of the Ukrainian government to support the internally displaced people. How has that been affected since the war began, and how much of the services are being devolved to local community organizations? Karen, do you have any insights into this, or Paulina?
I really don't know. I'm sure Paulina and others who are much more tapped into what's going on there would know. So yeah.
So in terms of government, it does rely heavily on local networks, and what they're trying to do is to normalize the presence of people from one region in other region, pretending that not that nothing dramatic happened, but reminding that these people are not refugees, they're at home. And actually this discourse of internally displaced people, it was popular, and actually the expression was used very actively at the beginning. Now the main message from the government is that these people are home, just help them feel home. In terms of basic services that the government provides, there are services such as government, various sorts of government payments that are still available to people regardless of where they are, but the government has not mobilized any special resource to accommodate these people. For example, there was no centralized effort to transform, say, hotels or resorts into the facilities to host internally displaced people. Instead, local communities and personal owners of the hotels and resorts and theaters and schools took the initiative to help people who arrive from the war-affected regions. So as far as it goes for government response, it is lacking there, and the government relies heavily on local networks and local activists.
Thank you, Polina. Any other questions from the audience? And by the way, I would encourage everyone to save the chat, because along with the remarks from the panelists, we've had a very interesting conversation in the chat. Okay, well, Polina, I have a more philosophical question, perhaps, for you. And this is something that we included in the event announcement earlier. But what potential do you see for long-term reconciliation between Russians and Ukrainians, given allegations of atrocities? What is it going to take for Russians and Ukrainians to see each other as brother nations again, or at least to have friendly relations with one another?
I have no good news for the Russian world concept in terms of this war. So the Kremlin for the long time was advancing this Russian world concept, appealing to the Slavic nations as brotherly nations and people who speak Russian as compatriots living abroad. This war delivered a dramatic blow to this idea. So I am not sure that it is relevant to talk about reconciliation or any sort of brotherhood, because from the Ukrainian point of view, this reference to the brotherly nation is now seen as a form of violence imposed, like violent relationship imposed upon the weaker part of the equation, which is the Ukrainians. And this reference to brotherhood is interpreted by Ukrainians as a matter of no choice, because if we say friendly nations, you can befriend or unfriend people. But if we talk in terms of family ties, you have to deal with your brother. So I'm rather confident that brotherly nations will not be a relevant reference for the future. And maybe counterintuitively, I would suggest that refraining from using that phrase would be necessary for any kind of reconciliation. So it's almost breaking up the relationship completely and then starting building it from scratch while acknowledging the wrongdoings of the past would be more productive than referring to the common past and common roots, because there is no denial on the Ukrainian side that Ukrainians and Russians, they share some kind of shared history. Ukrainians are just in general not happy about that history. So, and this war is the matter of not whether, oh, deep in history, we're the same nation. The question is, what do we want to do in the future? And for Ukrainians, the answer, we don't want to be the same thing. So the first thing that Ukrainians would focus on now is actually separation from from the Russian historical narrative, from the Russian outlook of the future, and from the Russian presence on the Ukrainian land. And when I say it, I don't mean native ethnic Russians, I mean the representative of the Russian Federation, either it's Russian military or Russian bureaucracy. That's important. So the first step would be complete separation. And what kind of bridges can be built across that cleavage? That's the question of tens and maybe hundreds of years. But the first main important step would be actually to acknowledge the separation and independence before that bridge even can begin to be built again.
Thank you, Polina. And I completely acknowledge how complicated the identity issues are. Of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin has taken the notion of brother nations even a step further by saying that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, which of course Ukrainians completely deny. But for a long time, the narrative that Russians and Ukrainians are brother nations was seen as a legitimate one, even by Ukrainians. And I think now that's changing to a large degree. But perhaps someday in the future, long after the war is over, there can be a reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine. There's a discussion in the chat about casualty numbers on the Ukrainian side. Polina, do you have any insights into this?
I would just make a remark that both governments, Ukrainian and Russian, operate in the regime of military optimism, over-reporting the casualties of the other side and under-reporting the casualties on their side. So every time when you see anything reported by the governments, you have to be very careful, keeping in mind that, again, regime of military optimism in their reporting. I would recommend looking at investigative journalists such as Conflict Intelligence Team. It's a Russian team that actually work on independently verifying the Russian losses, first of all, but also Ukrainian losses and any information reported from Ukrainian side. For example, Ukraine was caught on over-reporting the number of generals killed in action, and Conflict Intelligence Team caught them on this. At the same time, Russia is constantly caught on all sorts of lies, and Conflict Intelligence Team is working through open source intelligence to verify any claims by any governments. So far, we understand that Ukrainians, correct me if I'm wrong, because I was not following on that number for a while, claim over 20,000 of Russian troops killed in this war. Independent investigative journalists say it's somewhere between 15 and 17. So it's close, but it's a philosophical question now. What's the difference between 17 and 20 for the Russian Federation? And it's only the Russian Federation that can answer that question. But clearly, even though Ukrainians are over-reporting the number of Russian troops killed in this war, their optimism is rather modest. In terms of what Russia is reporting domestically, I don't think that Vladimir Putin even has a real picture of what's going on with his military in Ukraine.
Thank you, Polina. We just have a few minutes left, so perhaps I can give each of the panelists a chance to say some final words. Karen, would you like to make some final remarks?
Gosh, I would say it's super interesting to have this discussion and to hear from our colleagues who are really tuned in, from people like Polina and other of our students who, it's really wonderful that we have that, because in any kind of war or ongoing emergency, it's really good to have someone who's tapped into and tuned into what's happening there. But I also think, we need to, in all of these emergencies, we just need to keep I hear what you said, Paulina, about, you know, amping up the and sort of worrying about, you know, putting this in context and that media should give equal say to all of this. But in fact, the media has a very narrow view about what the news is, and there's no way it's going to push things off the front page, you know, in the interest of being fair. It's just not going to. So we need other sources of information besides the media and besides social media. And I honestly don't know where that comes from. I don't believe that it exists anymore. You know, it used to be the case that there were journalists and foreign correspondents who were trained and could send us fairly reliable. And that we just don't have that anymore. We have journalists who rush to an emergency, who don't know the context, who don't understand the politics, who are just feeding the frenzy. And unfortunately, that's very sad. So maybe there'll be a swing back to the other direction, but I doubt it. So.
Thanks, Karen. And yes, it's very interesting to see the contrast in terms of how the war is covered in the West as opposed to other countries, particularly in the global South. And I'm always surprised by the fact that we have a 24-hour news cycle, but oftentimes Western media is really only focused on one or two stories at a time. Greg, any final thoughts?
Let's stop from two things. One is, I think, well, depending on how long this drags on, you have to think about how to continue to support the humanitarian needs, whether that's with in the refugee side or with IDPs, supporting the government, the Ukrainian government, to provide services. And secondly, as I said earlier, it's not too early to think about rebuilding and thinking about it now. I think it'll be interesting to see what the contrast is in terms of reconstruction between Ukraine and Syria. Not a lot of money to rebuild Syria, but I suspect that there will be a lot of money to try to rebuild in Ukraine. Yeah, let's leave it at that.
Thank you, Greg. Paulina?
Yeah, as a closing remark, I just want to reiterate something that I mentioned before, that when we watch the news and when we read the stories and when we ask our Ukrainian or Russian or friends from the neighborhood about what's going on, it's important to keep in mind the hierarchies of reporting, of suffering, of power that actually produce the data that we refer to. And when it comes to and these hierarchies that affect every aspect that we discussed here, including the international response to human suffering. So when we talk about great help by international actors to Ukraine, the question is who actually established the scale by which we measure it, or why some conflicts are more important than others. It's because of those hierarchies. I have no silver bullet on how to flatten those hierarchies and help us better understand what's going on. But if we at least keep this in mind, that, well, maybe it's Ukrainians who have to determine what they need in this particular war, it would help us also to look at other conflicts, keeping in mind our place and the place of international organizations in those crises and conflicts.
Thanks, Paulina. And of course, last but not least, John.
I did not mention anything about human rights law, so I'll take my closing remarks opportunity to just say a quick couple of words. This situation implicates two very controversial issues in human rights law. One, so-called extraterritorial application of human rights law for Russia. To what extent is it bound by its human rights obligations when acting on the territory of another state? The other is simultaneous application of human rights law and humanitarian law, whether and to what extent the rules of human rights law apply during a situation of armed conflict, to what extent do they yield to the rules of the law of armed conflict. Now, the European Court of Human Rights has brought some coherence to these questions, has staked out positions on both of these issues. But as you may have heard, Russia was first suspended. Its rights of participation were suspended in the Council of Europe, and then Russia withdrew from the Council of Europe. As a consequence, it means it will no longer be a party to the European Convention on Human Rights or subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. However, denunciations take 6 months to be effective. So for the time being, Russia remains a party And certainly any conduct that occurs during this 6-month window would still be subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. So there may yet be some pronouncements of the court on this situation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to all the panelists, and please join me in a round of applause for everyone who participated. All right, and with that, we conclude this event, and this is one of our final events of the semester, of the academic year, but certainly the war in Ukraine is far from over, and we look forward to having you join us for future conversations about the conflict and the humanitarian crisis in the next academic year. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Arik.
Eric,
Thank
thanks,
you,
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.